India was supposed to be America's insurance policy against China, a democratic giant, a billion-strong market, a rising manufacturing hub. But in 2025, Trump's tariffs just turned that strategic ally into a ticking time bomb. Overnight, New Delhi is threatening to freeze American projects from tech to energy, and at the center of it all sits Apple, the $3 trillion crown jewel of US innovation. The very company that fled China to find safety in India now finds itself trapped in a geopolitical storm it never saw coming. Reports from the Economic Times warn Apple's factories in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka could be shut down. Financial Times calls it a direct hit on US strategy. And behind the scenes, India is quietly holding talks with China, signaling a shift that could shake the world order itself. Where are you watching from? Comment below, hit like, and subscribe, because this story is only getting started. Trump thought he could strong-arm India with tariffs. But this wasn't the 1990s, when Washington could dictate terms to emerging economies. This was 2025. India wasn't a weak player anymore. It was a $4 trillion economy, a nuclear power, and a nation with leverage over US tech, energy, and defense supply chains. Yet Trump still pulled the trigger. A 50% tariff on Indian goods, packaged as America first, but delivered like a slap in the face. The White House believed New Delhi would swallow it. After all, hadn't India benefited from US markets? Didn't Washington provide a counterweight to China? That was the assumption. But inside India, it was read differently. Not as negotiation, not as strategy, but as humiliation. Indian media outlets lit up with headlines calling it an insult, a deliberate attempt to reduce India to a junior partner. Politicians across party lines, from ruling BJP to opposition Congress, denounced Trump's move. Nationalist commentators framed it as colonial arrogance, America treating India as a pawn, not a partner. And in Indian politics, once you touch national pride, there's no walking back. That pride had been carefully built. Over the past decade, India was not just growing economically, it was asserting itself as an independent power. It hosted the G20. It positioned itself as a voice for the global South. It negotiated energy deals with Russia, gas pipelines with the Middle East, and infrastructure investments with Japan. Unlike the India of the past, this India had options. And the US? It had bet heavily on India as its new manufacturing base, especially Apple. Apple's retreat from China had been one of the most dramatic shifts in global supply chains. For years, China had been Apple's fortress, the factory floor of the world. But with US-China tensions escalating, iPhones became a political liability. Tariffs, sanctions, and the specter of war in the Taiwan Strait made China risk too big to ignore. So Apple moved. And where did it go? India. The timing couldn't have been better for both sides. India was offering billions in subsidies under its Make in India program. It dangled tax breaks, land and labor incentives. More importantly, it dangled a market, 1.4 billion people, rising incomes, and a government eager to showcase Apple as proof that India could replace China as the world's workshop. The Economic Times proudly announced that Apple was on track to shift a quarter of its global production to India by 2026. This was supposed to be the golden partnership, but Trump's tariffs shattered that illusion. Because the moment Washington taxed Indian goods at 50%, New Delhi's policymakers asked, why should we protect American companies? Why should we bend over backwards for Apple when the US is humiliating us on trade? And that's when the whispers began. Officials in Delhi started floating the idea of freezing Apple's projects, not shutting them permanently, but suspending approvals, delaying shipments, tightening inspections, a bureaucratic chokehold. The Financial Times reported that Apple executives were extremely concerned after meetings with Indian trade officials. Economic Times warned of billions in stranded assets. Think about what that means. Tens of thousands of Indian workers employed in Apple's supply chain suddenly at risk. Billions in factories potentially stranded, and Apple, the world's most valuable company, caught in the middle of a geopolitical storm it couldn't control. But this wasn't just about Apple. Freezing Apple was symbolic. It was India saying, "We are not your pawn. If you punish us, we can punish you back, right where it hurts." Behind the scenes, India was already preparing its next card. In Dubai, senior Indian and Chinese officials held discreet meetings on energy cooperation. In Jakarta, they discussed local currency trade settlements. According to the South China Morning Post, talks were moving toward a rupee-yuan trade corridor, that would allow both nations to bypass the US dollar in energy and commodity deals. For Washington, this was a nightmare, because the US had built its entire Asia strategy on the assumption that India would stand as a bulwark against China. But now, India was signaling that it could work with Beijing when it suited its interests. And at the center of this pivot sat the BRICS bloc. Later this year, India will host the BRICS Plus Summit. Already, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa are pushing for deeper currency integration. The idea? To settle oil, gas, and tech trade not in dollars, but in national currencies. For years, it was talk. But now, with India angered by US tariffs, that talk was becoming action. If India and China formalize a rupee-yuan settlement system, it will not only weaken the dollar in Asia, it will send a message to the world. America no longer controls the game. That's why Apple's factories matter so much. They're not just about phones, they're about leverage, about who gets to dictate the rules of the 21st century economy. And in New Delhi, the calculation was simple. If Trump wants a trade war, India is ready. But that wasn't the whole story, because what came next would escalate the crisis even further. And this time, it wouldn't just be tariffs. When word spread that India was preparing to choke Apple's factories, Wall Street panicked. Analysts warned that even a temporary freeze could wipe billions off Apple's market value. Remember, this wasn't just another company. This was the world's most valuable corporation, worth over $3 trillion. Apple's iPhones weren't just gadgets. They were cultural icons, status symbols, and profit machines fueling the US stock market itself. If Apple stumbled, the ripple effects would slam Silicon Valley, global investors, and even ordinary Americans with retirement accounts tied to Apple stock. That's how deep this went. But New Delhi wasn't bluffing. Reports from the Economic Times said government officials were reviewing all US-linked projects in light of unfair trade actions that meant more than Apple. It meant defense contracts, energy investments. Even US firms like Amazon and Google could be dragged into the line of fire. For Washington, this was a disaster in the making, because America wasn't just fighting one trade war. It was now facing the possibility of losing its single most important ally in Asia. And that's when China saw its opening. Beijing had long feared US-India alignment. For years, Washington had courted New Delhi. Military drills in the Indian Ocean, defense pacts, tech transfers, even intelligence sharing. The goal was obvious: build India into a counterweight to China. But Trump's tariffs gave Beijing something money couldn't buy: leverage. Within weeks, Indian and Chinese diplomats were spotted in Jakarta discussing a joint energy initiative. According to the South China Morning Post, they explored the creation of a BRICS energy corridor, linking Indian refiners with Russian and Middle Eastern suppliers, settled not in dollars but in rupees and yuan. If implemented, that would be historic. It would mean two of Asia's giants, once bitter rivals, creating a trade mechanism outside US reach. And it wouldn't stop there. The BRICS Plus Summit, hosted by India, was shaping up to be a turning point. Sources close to the discussions hinted that India was preparing to formally back rupee-yuan settlements, potentially joining Russia and Brazil in demanding a dollar alternative. For the US, this was the nightmare scenario. Because once BRICS offered a credible path to bypass the dollar, dozens of nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia would follow. But in 2025, the opposite happened. Tariffs designed to isolate Beijing ended up pushing New Delhi closer to it. India was no longer acting like a junior partner. The Hindustan Times captured it best. This is India's declaration of independence, not from colonial Britain, but from American hegemony. The US now faced a terrible question. How do you retaliate against a country that holds the keys to your tech supply chain, your software engineers, and your geopolitical strategy in Asia? So here's where we stand. America thought tariffs would bend India into submission. Instead, they triggered something far more dangerous, a pivot that could shatter decades of US strategy. Apple, the crown jewel of Silicon Valley, is staring at collapse in the very markets it once counted on for growth. China and India, once rivals, are finding common ground through BRICS and currency settlements. And the US dollar, its dominance is suddenly under siege. This isn't just about trade, it's about the future of power itself. If Washington can lose India, what else can it lose? Energy markets? Tech leadership? Global credibility? The next moves will decide whether America holds its place or watches a new order rise. But what do you think? Are Trump's tariffs a bold gamble or a catastrophic miscalculation? Comment below, subscribe, and stay tuned, because this story is only getting started.